Mr. Nishant, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here at the Interspecies Conclave hosted by the Atria University.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me here.
Thank you. You've spent the last decade of your life researching about the conservation of elephants, their relationship with humans, and the impact of human development on the elephants. Before we dive a little deeper into that, I just wanted to know how your journey began and what got you into the idea of conserving elephants.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to everyone from the morning, and I look forward to the sessions in the afternoon as well. For me, when I was young, I grew up in Mysore, which is very close to a lot of the best parks, national parks and wildlife sanctuaries that we have, like Nagarhole, Bandipur, and all of these places. And my parents would usually take us out, to these parks during holidays. And I think I fell in love with the elephant. So it was really that curiosity of the elephant, how it lives its life, how it's interacting with other elephants, how it's interacting with its ecosystem at large, the trees, the plants, other animals. That fascinated me. And I always hoped to one day, live alongside elephants and see what they were doing, like any young kid's dream of, fantasy of being in the forest and walking with the elephants. But I think as I grew older and got to know elephants better, I also realized that the lives of the elephants were much more complex than what I thought it was, or what I had seen it to be, in the documentaries and things. The elephants had a tough life. They were interacting a lot with people, and the people who had to deal with these elephants also were living tough lives. And that's what really drew me to start working on the human-elephant interaction bit of it. Although I would have really hoped to just be inside the forest with the elephants, but that's not the reality of things.
I was actually going through your paper called the Rurban Elephant, and I was quite fascinated by the amount of time and effort that has gone into the paper. I would love for our viewers to know a little more about the project, what's the current state, and what's the vision behind the Rurban Elephant.
Right. So what we do is we have a long-term project which aims at understanding elephants' decision-making processes. So the decision-making by an elephant is governed by multiple things. It could be its local ecological anthropogenic settings. It could be its own innate biological parameters. For example, which age is the elephant in? Male elephants, when they reach a certain stage, they come into must, a state of sexually heightened activity in elephants, which makes them indulge in certain behaviors that they usually don't otherwise. So there are physiological changes that you'll start seeing, which was reflected in the behavior of the animal as well. So over time, you'll start seeing these changes. And so our idea is to really understand elephants over time, because they're long-lived species. An elephant can live up to about 70 years. It has a very complex social life. They're born into a herd. When they grow up, the male elephants, when they reach a certain stage of 12, 14, 15 years, they reach their adolescence, they leave the herd and they move out. Whereas the females continue to stay in the herd. So there are a lot of similarities in the human societies, parallels, I would say, in the human society as well. And so it's important to track them over time, because the decision making by the elephant would depend on all of these various factors. And the system in which they are in itself is very dynamic. It keeps changing. It's not a static system. So the elephants that I started studying and the observations that I've had of them inside the forest, they also would go out and feed from the crops, some of them, which brought me to the non-forest bit of it. And when you're working in the human-dominated landscapes, you see elephants interact with a number of artifacts that are human-made. For example, roads, fences that farmers have around their crop fields, electricity poles, canals, vehicles that they see, buildings that they see, number of things. Now for the elephant, that is new when it's first coming to that sort of a landscape. And so, but they're quick learners, extremely good cognitively. And so they pick up and learn very fast. And they also have the ability to transfer this information very quickly to other members of the society. So the elephants can learn very quickly. And so generations of elephants that have now come and have been exposed to humans, well, for a lot of them, that is the norm right now. They've gotten used to seeing people. They've gotten used to being chased by people. They've gotten used to crossing roads. Some of the elephants, I think, look left and right before they cross road nowadays. They can open gates, for example, without damaging them. They know multiple things about people. And over time, you see a lot of these rural areas are urbanizing fast. And so that peri-urban space is what we call as the Rurban. And the elephant who's using that peri-urban space, between the built-up concrete buildings and the crop fields that are still there, are navigating this space and they're learning more. In some sense, they're learning modernization, but they're also getting into trouble while they do this. The reason why they come into these crop fields is so that they can feed on rich, nutritious, palatable crop and build their body size as quickly as possible. It's a foraging strategy that the elephants used, which is advantageous for them when they're back inside the forest. But this adaptive strategy could soon become maladaptive because urbanization is really coming in fast. Will the elephants be able to learn as quickly as we urbanize and bring new things to them? I'm very doubtful of that. And so our Rurban Elephant and the behavioral ecology of the elephant project is really to understand how the elephants behave and respond to the changes we bring to their landscape, so that we can inform ourselves and the various stakeholders who are interacting with the elephants as to what to do in order to conserve the species.
So, sir, actually, I am from a creative background, and while I was going through your research paper, I couldn't help but be fascinated by the way you track the elephants, you map the elephants, and also visually represent all of these statistics and data so that it's easier for any person to understand what's happening with this project or what's happening with the elephants. Would you like to tell me how this process looks like, be it the data collection part or the visual representation part?
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I keep talking about is the non-human centric design, which I think falls squarely in the realm of what you do. And it means planning our landscapes to have actions that are compatible with the non-human use of the landscape, to be inclusive and not be exclusionist in the approach. And that's where I think design really kicks in. The data, the way we collect data is through a lot of field work. We go out into the forest, or if the elephants are in the crop fields, try to look at them, observe them in the crop fields, identify individuals, try to figure out who they are with, what they're trying to do, how much they're feeding, where they're feeding, how they're socializing, what is their time activity budget is something that we try to assess, which is what is the proportion of time an elephant spends in different activities during the day. And we do this through direct observations. We sit and watch elephants. Sometimes it's not possible always to observe elephants because of the dense forest cover, and at night you can't be inside the forest where the elephants are. So there you use technology interventions like camera traps or acoustic recorders and things like that, that still keep collecting data on the elephants. There are certain advanced ways in which you can put a collar around an elephant, a satellite collar, and then you track their movement as well. But you don't need to do that all the time because wisely spaced camera traps over a large area can actually pick up information on movement patterns of elephants, of individual elephants over time. The key is that you have continued presence over a very long period of time because the lifespan of the elephant is also quite long. So that's the data collection process. And once you collect that information, like you said, how do we visualize it? Visualization is important in two ways. One is for ourselves to understand what the pattern is, to visualize the pattern itself. The second is to communicate that pattern to the stakeholders. And the way we visualize it is we use a number of decision-making trees. So we run statistical analysis on the data that has been collected. The individual elephant identification itself is based on close to 114 features that we map on an elephant's body. Once we get all of that, we get an idea of what the elephants are trying to do. And to visualize it in terms of a map, what we end up doing is, currently we're using an individual agent-based modeling network called NetLogo. There are many other individual agent-based modeling platforms available, which basically helps us give certain conditions for the movement or the behavior and activity of the elephant, and you let it run. And it runs in that platform, giving you a map of what it potentially can do. And these are powerful tools which you can then take to policymakers, to farmers, and to other people to show them visually what the impacts of certain of our actions could be.
Coming back to the topic of discussion today, which is the interspecies movement, you have been working with the local communities and tribal communities for a long time. And the idea of interspecies conclave is creating a digital twin for each species and adding a certain amount of currency which leads to biodiversity conservation. How do you envision making these tribal communities or these local communities understand a concept like this? Do you anticipate any challenge or backlash?
Well, I think it will be extremely filled with challenges, definitely, because I find it difficult to understand. And we are trying to communicate what is, whenever you talk to the farmers and the communities who are interacting with elephants on a regular basis, for them, the day-to-day interaction takes up a lot of their mind space. The interest is, what do I do tomorrow? How do I build on what I have tomorrow? So a lot of the energy and resources goes into planning that. I don't think they have the privilege, like a lot of us do, to think of what's going to happen in the future. And so when you try to bring a concept into the world that they are in right now, and the elephants are in right now, it has to be tangible in some sense. So it's important to show how this operates or works and what they get out of it. I think unless it's shown as a pilot, as as something that there is an outcome which is tangible, it's all in the air otherwise. So I think the challenge for us is really to transform the theoretical information that we have on this to make it practical. And of course, I think there's going to be a number of hurdles, logistical issues, a number of these things that are going to come up. But eventually, I think the idea should be to take it to the local communities, because they spend a lot more time with the animals and with the land and with the nature than we do potentially. And so a lot of the decision making has to be based on what the local communities feel, and also in terms of our, and by our I mean the local communities and all of the people's conservation goals are for this protection of the species. Because at the end of the day, I think it's like going back to the third standard textbook and saying every species is very important in the web of life. And so it's very important that we don't lose out on the endangered species and other species that are there, out there.
Yeah, definitely. All right, sir. For the last question today, you have been working with the elephants for the past decade. And my question is, how do you envision the next decade, the coming 10 years of India, in context to conservation of elephants and our relationship of humans and elephants?
I think very realistically over the next decade, it's going to be extremely challenging, because I think development is coming big time.
Yes.
And a lot of the elephants live in very fragile habitats today. So any changes to those habitats are going to really have serious consequences for the lives of the individual elephants, and also to on the lives of people who are living alongside these elephants. So I think we have to be extremely cautious in terms of our development goals. And like I said, if our development goals does have a more than human design to it, and we acknowledge that this particular development activity is going to impact not just our lives, but the lives of other animals, and in what ways. And if we address those issues, I think we'll have a much more harmonious development than what is currently happening today. And I think that's something that we should really take care of, raise our voices and say, it's not that you don't want to develop, it's about how do you develop alongside other species.
Coexist.
Exactly.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Mr. Nishant, for giving us your valuable time. I got a lot of insightful information, and I really look forward that our listeners also get a lot of information from this podcast. And thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking to
pleasure.
you, and I look forward to the rest of the sessions.
Thank you. Thank
Thanks.
you so much.